The presidential office here has shared details of the president's upcoming agenda in neighboring Japan and over in the US as we count down less than 24 hours to the start of his diplomatic engagements. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Friday, August 22nd here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. President Lee Jae Myung is scheduled to depart for Tokyo Saturday morning for his first bilateral diplomatic engagements, starting in Tokyo, ending in Washington, D.C. For more on this, I have Kelly Kasulis Cho with American Daily, The Washington Post here in the studio. Kelly, as always, it's great to have you here.
Happy to be here.
I also have Walter Sibb with Singaporean daily, The Straits Times, based over in Tokyo, of course. Walter, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Likewise, thank you so much for having me.
Right, and we will start here in the studio, Kelly. So President Lee Jae Myung is scheduled to depart for Tokyo, as I mentioned earlier, tomorrow for talks with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. Now, ahead of his summit, he spoke with Japanese daily Yomiuri Shimbun about bilateral ties. Let's start off with what he said and your takeaways.
Yeah, there were a lot of interesting things out of that interview. I mean, both sides expressed in June that they want to steadily improve their ties. And I think this is somewhat to be expected, but it's worth noting that, you know, the Democratic Party presidents have always been a little bit more adversarial towards Japan, largely over historical issues. Japan used to colonize South Korea, and quite brutally. And so for President Yi to come in and to start right off the bat with the desire to improve relations, I think that signaled a lot of optimism between Tokyo and Seoul. And the other interesting thing that came out of that interview is that he seemed to allude to the fact, President Yi seemed to allude to the fact that visiting Japan before the United States was a choice with some significance. He had said that, quote, it was meant to put into practice what Tokyo and Seoul had agreed upon. Within the United States, this might be read by some analysts as a little bit of a snub or a further suggestion that President Trump's increasingly adversarial stance towards various U.S. allies might be pushing some of these parties together. So, for instance, Japan and Korea might have more incentive to prioritize their relationship together over their relationship with the United States because they're kind of getting the signal that they're on their own, right? A little bit in terms of trade. Certainly some security partnerships have been put on kind of unsteady footing. So all of this is to say, it's not as if there have been these major declarations that, Washington and Seoul are not close anymore, but there's just been a lot of reading the tea leaves, and South Korea seems to be putting its domestic interests first. I think, in general, the United States and South Korea, when they're dealing with kind of a wild card administration, their relationship is a little bit on unsteady footing. President Trump has suggested that, South Korea should pay more for U.S. troops' presence on the peninsula. He's even mentioned in the past the idea that maybe he doesn't want so many troops in South Korea. So from South Korea's perspective, it seems like it would be in their best interest to get closer to Japan.
Right, and that being said, Walter, what has been the response over there in Japan to these remarks by the South Korean president? Do you believe they've served to perhaps set a positive tone for productive ties amid geopolitical uncertainty over U.S. trade and security policies, as Kelly mentioned?
Well, definitely, and I really agree with what Kelly said earlier about the history of adversarial relationships with Japan when there is a democratic government in South Korea. And hence, in that light, there is a lot of optimism. There is a lot of significance behind President Lee Jae Myung's visit to Tokyo at the weekend, and there is a lot of positivity over what this might portend for the future trajectory of bilateral ties with a close neighbor. And I think the background of this really is how last Friday was 80 years to the day Japan surrendered in World War II, and which was marked as Liberation Day on the Korean Peninsula. And because of that, there was a bit of trepidation in Japan of how its neighbors would react on such a milestone anniversary. Of course, we all know that China is going to launch a major Victory Day parade on September 3rd, but Japan is really taking heart in President Yi's comments that Japan is a very important country, as he spoke last Friday of the need for both countries to build a future-oriented relationship. So those comments, I think, were further reinforced by the interview that President Yi gave to the Yomiuri newspaper, which was published earlier this week. And as we have been discussing, so President Yi did say that it would be undesirable and unproductive for bilateral agreements over historical issues like wartime labor and comfort women that have been struck by previous administrations to be overturned. Of course, that's not to say that there are no outstanding issues that might cloud bilateral relationships between both countries. So, for instance, there is still the territorial dispute over the Dokdo Islets that Japan claims and calls Takeshima, for example. But I do see a lot of political will in both countries to keep this positive momentum going, especially since it is also 60 years since Japan and South Korea began diplomatic ties. So looking beyond this visit, I did see some reports in Japanese media that Defense Minister Gen Nakatani will likely visit South Korea for talks on September 8th. And if that trip happens, he would also be the first defense chief to visit South Korea in 10 years. And looking beyond the politics and security, there is a lot of positive momentum between people-to-people exchanges as well. Tourism numbers of Japanese visiting South Korea and vice versa are at all-time highs, and there is news about a further relaxation of rules to foster greater people-to-people exchanges. And so I think it's quite foolhardy politically if any politician were to cast a poll over bilateral ties at this point. But all that said, I think it would be very interesting to see what Mr. Ishiba says and does, and how he would build on this bilateral relationship, and whether both leaders would manage to achieve the sort of shuttle diplomacy that was evident between their predecessors.
Right, and speaking about comments by Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, Walter, recent remarks by the Prime Minister with regard to World War II also made headlines. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Definitely, there is a lot of symbolism in what Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba would say about the war, given how he is effectively a historian. He has read up a lot about history, about World War II, how it broke out, and Japan's actions at the time, and with that background, I think the fact that he used the word remorse, he became the first Japanese leader to use the word remorse for the first time in 13 years at the annual memorial ceremony for the dead. Of course, it would make headlines in Japan and around the region and the world. And Mr. Ishiba also said, and I quote, that Japan must never repeat the horrors of war. We must never again err on the path that we take. But of course, despite his remarks, he did draw some criticism. I note that in South Korea as well as China for sending a ritual offering to the Yasukuni Shrine, even though he did not visit in person. I don't think that is necessarily a deal breaker that would spoil bilateral relations, so long as there is some sort of mutual understanding over the rationale and purpose behind the visit. So just a bit of background, I think there's a lot of attention on the Yasukuni because of the 14 Class A war criminals that are enshrined there, and rightly so that there is a lot of attention. But that said, these 14 war criminals are amongst the souls of more than 2.5 million war dead enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine. Many of them are indoctrinated foot soldiers who laid down their lives for the country. And in Japan, such visits are really seen as more out of empathy towards citizens who were prepared to lay down their lives in the call of duty. So on the subject of history, and I'm Singaporean, by the way, and Singapore, of course, was invaded by the Japanese and had come under the Japanese occupation from 1942 to 1945. So Mr. Ishiba in May did talk about a meeting he had with the late former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, in which Mr. Lee asked him if he was aware of what Japan did in Singapore during the war. And Mr. Ishiba replied with his knowledge from Japanese history textbooks, only to be told off by Mr. Lee for his lack of knowledge. So without passing any judgment and taking a very objective stance as a Singaporean looking at, history and Japan's place in it, I do think that its actions in World War II will continue to hang a cloud over Japan, but also do think that Japan is sincere about its pleasures of never becoming an aggressor again.
Right, and staying with that then, Kelly, back here in South Korea, what has been the response to the recent remarks by Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba?
Yeah, well, Walter really kind of laid out very eloquently the very tenuous historical relationship at the diplomatic level that we see between South Korea and Japan. So looking at Korean media and kind of the reaction to that speech, as he mentioned, using things like the word remorse, sometimes that got translated a little bit to reflection in English. That was very newsworthy in South Korea because in general, the Korean public and the Korean media seems to really want to seek something on the level of an apology or an acknowledgement of some of the war crimes that happened during the colonial era in Korea, in particular comfort women who were essentially sex slaves. That issue continues to be a thorn in their relationship between Japan and South Korea. So, some of the words that I saw in the media was forward-looking or positive. So I think that sincerity that Walter is talking about, it seemed to resonate at least with the Korean media. Whenever I talk about Japan-South Korea relations, I think it's always worth noting for people who are not physically here that when we're talking about that tenuous relationship, we are largely talking about at the geopolitical kind of diplomatic level. I mean, Japan and South Korea are major trade partners. There's major cultural exchange. If you walk through Seoul, there's a million Japanese restaurants here, right? And vice versa in Japan. There's people vacationing here from Japan. There's so many Koreans that go to Japan for vacation. So that is to say that we're talking about a very difficult and complicated historical relationship, but on the ground level, that hatred is not necessarily there. But of course, there are people on the fringes everywhere. And we have seen some anti-Japanese sentiment really build in past years and show up in a meaningful way among the South Korean populace. So I remember before COVID, those no Japan boycotts were extremely significant. And that was over kind of what was perceived as a trade snub. But the South Korean populace really rallied together and started boycotting Japanese goods to the point where it really affected sales. Uniqlo's shut down. And so I think it's worth noting that the relationship is also complicated on the ground. There has been in past years, especially during Democratic Party administrations, kind of a broad stroke anti-Japanese sentiment about politics, less about, ethnic tensions. And so this is kind of maybe in the era of a Trump presidency opening a new chapter or a new opportunity to warm ties. Ties are already not that chilly compared to, like, say, South Korea and North Korea, right? But to warm them and to improve trade.
Right. And speaking about South Korea and the U.S., Walter, the two countries are slated to hold a summit next Monday. And on the agenda, of course, are tariffs and trade, among other issues of bilateral interest. Having said that, Walter, what is the latest with regard to Japan's trade talks with the U.S.?
Well, as has been reported, Japan managed to somehow strike a surprise trade deal with the US that brought down so-called reciprocal tariffs to 15% from 25%. Tariffs on cars and car parts would also be lowered to 15% under their trade deal, which would also have Japan investing US $550 billion in the United States. But there is still no paper agreement, and US Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick did say a couple of days ago that the formal a formal deal on paper with Japan was still weeks away. So because of that, there are still a lot of questions in Japan of what actually was discussed and what had actually been agreed on with the US. So there is still no clarity over when the lowered tariffs on the car industry will begin, for instance. And in the immediate days after the so-called deal, there was a lot of confusion here in Japan over whether the 15% tariff would be a flat rate or if it would be stacked onto other existing tariffs. So Japan believed that it would be a flat rate for items which had levies below 15%, whilst the US said otherwise. Only for Japan's chief trade negotiator to make his ninth trip to Washington to iron things out and get the confirmation from the US that actually Japan's interpretation of the deal was accurate. So this is just one example of many points that both countries still contradict each other on with regards to the deal. Especially the US $550 billion investment that Japan says is actually up to $550 billion. The US says it's at least $550 billion, for instance. Japan says that Tokyo will continue to have a say in how the money is invested and spent. But President Trump himself has said that, it's up to Washington to decide how it wants to use the money. So in that regard, there is still a lot of confusion over what the deal entails, even though that being said, that it has brought a lot of relief to businesses. Of course, there is still going to be a lot of impact on corporate margins because 15% is still higher than what it was before. But I think a lot of people, a lot of companies are taking the silver lining that, that rate is still lower than what is being faced by many other countries around the world, as well as the fact that, the ongoing weak yen might help provide some buffer.
Right. And here in the country, Kelly, President Lee Jae Myung sat down with corporate heavyweights earlier this week to try to hammer out a strategy for trade talks during his upcoming meeting with Mr. Trump. What can you tell us about this particular gathering and its implications?
Yeah, so the South Korean president is expecting to have a summit with President Trump on August 25th. So ahead of that, President Lee held a meeting with, the major executives, representatives of Samsung and Hyundai and other major conglomerates. And what this really underscores, and this is not necessarily new, but maybe it suggests that, these major South Korean companies are having even more influence on, Korean politics and the administration. Already, they have major influence over the economy here, right? And South Korea is an export-driven economy, so when faced with, 15% or higher in tariffs, as Walter mentioned, that's serious implications, especially considering the population here generally has not been seeing as fast of economic growth as in the past. And politically in South Korea, the economy, jobs, things like that continue to be the chronic issue that kind of pushes the country left and right politically, right? So, last month, as Walter mentioned, South Korea, at least verbally, we haven't seen a written agreement, but at least verbally agreed to 15% levies on all South Korean exports to the United States. And I'm sure nobody's happy about that here, but they are thinking it's better than, potentially higher rates that other countries are seeing. And so President Lee, according to South Korean media, actually thanked the representatives of Samsung and Hyundai for helping kind of arrange this deal. So again, the influence is really notable. And all of this is to say, the power of these companies in South Korea has often been criticized as, maybe they have too much influence on the government and things like that. But in this case, it might actually be working in South Korea's favor. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that, the Trump administration is breaking tradition a little bit. Generally speaking, trade and other geopolitical or diplomatic matters, there was a fairly hard line between those things and they could be negotiated separately. We even saw this a little bit more in the last Trump administration. But this time around, it seems like South Korea, if it's also going to worry about its security agreements with the United States, its diplomatic relations with the United States, and its place in the world, it's in its best interest to leverage its powers through Samsung and Hyundai to negotiate a good deal. And certainly the United States does need South Korean goods.
Right, then as Kelly just said, Walter, President Lee Jae Myung and his US host Donald Trump, they're also expected to engage in security talks, which of course are relevant to neighboring Japan, as we, colloquially speaking, share a backyard, if you will. Now, speaking as a foreign correspondent based there in Tokyo, what might the South Korean leader, Walter, be aiming to achieve, and what might he be hoping to avoid during his security talks with his American counterpart?
Well, that's a big question, and it's kind of impossible to read what's on President Trump's mind. But, well, he did criticize South Korea quite heavily, especially on the campaign trail over such issues as host nation support, over the defense sharing burden, and even, as Kelly mentioned, the number of US troops that are stationed in the country. So I think President Yi would be hoping to convince Mr. Trump at least to maintain the status quo. And that, I think, would be the bare minimum that he hopes to take away from the meeting. And of course, he would do his utmost to convince Mr. Trump that Seoul is really doing more than its fair share in their bilateral security alliance. I do think that the trilateral relationship, also involving Japan, might be on their agenda. And even though South Korea is primarily focused on the security on the Korean Peninsula, it does seem likely that the Taiwan Strait and Chinese assertiveness in the region could come up during the talks. North Korea, of course, has been relatively quiet recently in terms of ballistic missile tests and nuclear tests. But I think that President Yi would want to remind Mr. Trump that Pyongyang remains an existing and existential threat to the country. But of course, Mr. Yi's background and Mr. Trump's own history of having held bilateral summit meetings with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, I do think that there is a possibility for them to discuss ways of a breakthrough from the impasse over the North Korean issue.
Right. I suppose we'll wait and see if that is the case once the summit takes place next Monday. First, we have the summit over in Tokyo this coming weekend. Walt, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. As always, thank you so much for your insights today. And Kelly here in the studio, thank you very much for your time and thoughts.
Thanks.
Right, that ends this week's editions of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Have a great weekend. See you same time next Monday.